want me to give another speech? I've already got one speech. I will be here till Wednesday. I'm so moved. It's very moving, and it is I'm a lucky guy. See, I'm a lucky guy. All these people have been working, and all of you, and Salam, and Ari, you've been working to make this a great school, and then I get some credit, for taking a few trips and having a few lunches and seeing a few people. So lucky me to benefit for this remarkable achievement. I will say this. When I first met with Carlos Ivan, which was, about, 15 years ago, when the first conversation, I remember these conversations, which are even earlier than that, and then I got invited to meet with Carlos Ivan and some other people in Rio, and they started telling me about this. I had been thinking about the reform of Brazilian legal education since the 60s and the CEPED project, and I was very discouraged about the possibilities. The CEPED project was a wonderful project that flourished for 7 or 8 years. I won't go into details, but there's lots of articles about it for those who've never heard of it. But then the whole thing sort of dissipated for a variety of reasons that have been endlessly argued. So I was very discouraged, and so when I was invited to go, and here we are in the big, building in Rio, and Carlos Ivan, a big dinner or lunch or whatever it was, and I said, can they really do this? I mean, is this really possible because of all the obstacles that we had seen over this long period to any form of reform, let alone the kind of ambitious, global, national, international, doctrinal, empirical, all the mentions that Oscar mentioned, it seemed unbelievably ambitious. And I was worried, to be honest. So you're the ones who should be congratulated, not me. Great work, guys and girls. I'm just delighted. And I met with the students yesterday and read the titles of their papers. I looked at the papers for these 2 days, and I thought, this is really good. This is really the achievement. It's not just rhetoric. It's there. It's the real deal. And that's what makes me happy. So now another speech. One of the things about this, so there's kind of a subtext to this as we go on, because this whole presentation, which is the history of a field, or my relationship to the field, there's a Brazilian story, because everything that I've learned about law and development, almost everything, I've learned thanks to my engagement with Brazil. So a play in 2 acts. Act 1 from the State-Led Growth and Law and Development 1.0, I call it, to Scholars in Self-Estrangement. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Scholars in Self-Estrangement is an article that I wrote with Mark Galander. It was published in 1974, and everyone who's in this field recognized it as a sort of watershed. So even if you weren't Dave Trubeck, and even if you hadn't written a paper and you were trying to give this history, you would make Scholars in Self-Estrangement a particular turning point in the history of this academic enterprise worldwide. So it may be slightly narcissistic of me to organize the talk about around an article that I wrote 40 years ago, but it's my talk, and so I'm going to do it. So where did law and development start? It was, to some degree, to a significant degree, the outgrowth of the foreign aid program. That is, it was the first work in law and development in the United States was an effort by lawyers who worked for the U.S. Foreign Aid Agency to envision how law could contribute to economic and social development, something that had never been conceptualized, at least in American universities. It was worked out by people who were, like me, field lawyers working on day-to-day projects in developing countries, as I was in the 60s. And so a set of ideas grew up which were related to the prevailing challenges of development and the prevailing responses of the global development agencies and development studies scholars of the time. So what was the problem, the challenge? Developing countries had traditional sectors that did not want to change, and the private sector was too weak to provide what was called those days takeoff to self-sustaining growth. Domestic capital was limited, and capital markets were weak. As Irene knows and others, I spent years working on the ways to develop the Brazilian capital market. You could turn to foreign capital, but it wasn't necessarily interested in the same goals that the leaders of developing countries had identified, and given political and other uncertainties, it might not be available. There was capital available from international financial institutions, but it was channeled almost always through the state. And the non-commodity exports were uncompetitive, so you couldn't earn foreign exchange except through commodities, but the relative value of commodities versus imported manufactured goods was declining. So what did you do to deal with those? What were the pillars of development policy, let's say in the late 50s and the 60s? First was to rely heavily on state-owned enterprises in key industries because private capital could not take on the steel industry, the automotive, even the automotive industry, at least initially, and many other areas. But then at the same time try to bet on modernizing private sectors, and the state would have to do that, and it would also have to combat resistance of traditional sectors. This led to planning. So there was a great emphasis in those days on planning, and it was taken seriously. Particularly plans for the use of capital, whatever capital could be raised, either through directly or indirectly through taxation and inflation, because inflation was a tool used to generate investment. Of course, then you get the famous import substitution policy. So the state had to impose import controls and at the same time encourage exports, but there was the capacity to earn through non-commodity exports was very limited because of the lack of competitiveness of manufactured goods sectors. And of course, the state had to manage foreign exchange, which was very rare, very limited and sparse, and it also, of course, channeled all the foreign capital, public and private, coming in, particularly the public capital, which in Brazil in the 60s was the dominant form of capital coming in to the country because there wasn't much private capital until the 70s. There had been more in the 50s and very early 60s with the building of the auto industry, but that was sort of at a low point. So what was law and development? It was built on these pillars, on this whole thing. So what should law do? Empower the state, because this was state-led growth. remove traditional barriers because they were holding back private as well as public investment, and try to change the way people behaved economically. That was a vision. So you had to create the legal structures to control for macroeconomic control, central banks, that sort of thing. So translate policy goals into laws that channel economic behavior in accordance with national plans. I cut my teeth as a scholar trying to figure out how Brazil was translating the policy goal of having a domestic capital market into laws that would channel economic behavior of Brazilians who weren't investing in equity, in long-term investments, but were just actually for a while putting their money in physical objects because of the inflation, buy 6 cars and figure that was better than putting it in any financial institution because of they would hold their value while the financial instruments would lose their value before they invented monetary correction. This was just an example, but I was very much influenced in my thinking by this, and there was this interesting situation in which in Brazil in the 60s, the economists figured out the plans. The lawyers had nothing to do with the original planning, or even necessarily with the drafting of the legislation, and then the lawyers had to come in and pick up the pieces. And this became a very complex thing involving very sophisticated efforts to use tax incentives and other devices to get people to basically buy equities, is what it was. It didn't work that well, but at least there was an effort. And that's what, we thought, that when I thought about law and development, that was law and development. Figure out how to make a capital markets law work. Also, of course, because so much of the economy was controlled by the state, Law and Development 1.0 was about creating a legal framework for the state bureaucracy and state-owned enterprises, and then, of course, it was all this business of maintaining all the incredible regulatory structure that created the interface between Brazil and the world market as Brazil tried to develop in partial isolation from the world market in order to be able to industrialize at a time when Brazilian industry was simply not competitive. So if you allowed imports of manufactured goods, they would swamp the market. They would occupy the market. So behind all this and sort of working through the ideas of the law and development scholars like myself were ideas like this. So there was modernization theory, which had this idea that countries go through stages of growth from traditional to modern, that the United States and Western Europe was modern and every place else was something else, maybe traditional, semi-modern, quasi-modern, not quite modern enough, whatever. There was an acceptance of state-led development, something that for the United States was kind of heresy, right? State-led development was heresy for the United States, even though, thanks to the Defense Department, we had a lot of state-led development, but we didn't call it. We called it defense. So we thought that law could support the developmental state, foster modernization. We had to deal with pre-modern law because that's an obstacle to growth. And we could import modern law. That was the key idea. Here's the modern law up there in the north, it was mostly in the north, and it was modern. Why was it modern? Because it was in countries that were rich and who claimed to be modern countries, so there must be modern law. Ipso facto. If you go to a country that doesn't have what you think is modern law, what do? Take some law, put it in a box, ship it down there. There it is. That's it. This is called transplantation. And it, 40 or 50 years on, we laugh. But it was serious. It was taken seriously. I remember working on transplantation of the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, is it, or 33? 33. Securities and Exchange Act of 1933, the U.S. Securities. I mean, that was it, and that was it, and this was it. The only problem was just translating it properly, right? Oh, how do you translate, you know, whatever, debentures or whatever, and then everything be fine. Also, there was this idea that any reform of law would be liberal, would support human rights, civil rights, that law was automatically a liberal thing. This is an American lunatic idea, right? I mean, did we ever read anything about Franco, let alone the totalitarian states? They had law, wasn't very liberal. Boys, ladies, right? But we thought that if we strengthened the law, it would necessarily foster those goals. And that legal education was the change agent. That the way to change the law in developing countries was to change legal education. That was that was another idea that we had that we've kind of abandoned. Okay. So what was the academic field of law and development, 1965 to 1975? It was tiny, as both in terms of the academic dimensions and the actual assistance dimensions and projects, tiny relative to other things that were going on in development studies and in development assistance and development policies. It was a little tiny thing. A small group of lawyers in AID really, pushed the agency to do things. Ford Foundation played around with it. So that American universities got quite a bit of money, relatively speaking, from these agencies. There were big projects, big centers. There were centers at Yale, Stanford, Wisconsin, and Harvard. Those were the four major centers that got money either from Ford or from AID or both. And there was a specialized organization called the International Legal Center that was a foundation to support law and development that had been created by the Ford Foundation. So we thought we were on a roll. And here I was relatively young, and I was running what would be in today's terms a $7 million law and development research project at Yale. And how old was I? That was 1965. I was 30, okay? So we were on a roll. Well, things happened. And we began to realize that there were profound problems. I won't go into all the details as to how that changed. It was related to the Vietnam War and the recognition of certain parts of the American intelligentsia that American foreign policy had gone wrong somehow, and law and development, after all, it started as part of American foreign policy and Cold War policy, because law was what we had and the Russians didn't have that, so-called. So we wrote this article, Scars and Self-Estrangement, Mark and I, as our goal was to purify the field from its embeddedness in the foreign aid mission and therefore in foreign policy and therefore in a lot of sort of neo-imperialist views that we questioned. But we also felt that the ideas that I've just sketched out were, to some significant degree, wrong. So this article had a huge impact. I will say this. It had a huge impact because it crystallized a growing sense in the academic world that somehow the law and development movement had started on a series of questionable premises, some of which I've mentioned. But we wanted to strengthen the field. That was our goal. We were going to purify it, and therefore purify it from some of these errors and strengthen it as an academic project rather than just a byproduct of foreign assistance. So we said all these evolutionary narratives, you know, that countries go through these evolutionary stages, and the stages are the same, so that a country that is in a traditional stage will move to a modern stage, and what they will move to is what richer countries have, because they have moved higher on the evolutionary scale. This is a ridiculous idea, but it was deeply embedded in our thinking. We questioned the transplant. We pointed out that local legal systems are very deeply embedded in their cultures, and you just can't fly in and drop some new law from some other country and think it's going to work. We were worried that the reforms, instead of promoting liberal values, might strengthen authoritarian governments. We were skeptical that legal education could be a leading sector, that it was more likely that change outside of the law schools would create pressure for change within the law schools. Not that it was impossible for law schools to play a role, but that this idea they were the single, you know, you just put all your money on legal education reform. You couldn't change the law schools unless there was support outside of the law schools for the change. They did not have the independent resources, authority, legitimacy, and particularly in countries like Brazil, where the line between the law school and the profession at that time, and still to this day, was very vague and very porous. The interrelation is very porous. You really couldn't see it as we feared what some people call the pull of the policy audience, that is, that the scholars were writing the things that the agencies wanted to hear, rather than what was really, you know, what independent academic research would develop. And we pointed out that there wasn't, the theory was weak and the empirical data next to non-existent on which this whole framework had been built. So why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this critique emerge, and why was it so powerful? Well, and this is very important, I think, to understand where we are today. By the time that Solace and Self-Estrangement was written, the Law and Society movement had developed and had fostered the kind of theoretical sophistication, interdisciplinary capability, and empirical skills that the original law and development scholars did not have, because they were not promoted in law schools in which we were educated. Secondly, critical legal studies was beginning to question whether the American legal system was as liberal or as effective in carrying out its liberal goals, and therefore recognized that there were serious problems at home, which would then be magnified by the export of these systems. People from around the world began to come to American universities, partly paid for by all this money that we had got from these agencies, and from the global South, and they began to say, wait a minute, this is where did you get all this stuff from? You don't know anything. So I remember 3 Brazilians who showed up at Yale when when some of these discussions were going on. Boaventura de Souza Santos, Bolivar Lamonier, Roberto Unger, who were all 3 in the debates at Yale about what was wrong with law and development. So interesting, the contribution of these, who of course at that time weren't quite as well known as they are today, or whatever. And there was kind of a confluence of law and society people. Some of these names won't mean anything to you, but there was this moment when law and society, critique of American legal studies, bringing in perspectives from Europe and the global South, all came together, and we realized that we needed to rethink. We needed a rethink. Now, then the field began to lose momentum, and I'm not going to go into the details. Galanter and I were accused of having killed the field in our effort to purify it. This is our defense. I'm not going to go over it. I think the jury is I think we've been exonerated. I think that the case was dismissed, but some people still think that. But okay. So, but scholars coincided with the slowdown of the field, which I believe was for other reasons. Just quickly, all of a sudden, state-led growth became unpopular among the economists. It was the market, not the state, that was crucial. In fact, the state was the problem, not the solution. There was a huge turnaround within the economics profession. Lawyers began to see that maybe the growth didn't necessarily lead to democracy, equity, and the rule of law, so that had to be an independent goal. Therefore, there had to be built-in things about civil rights, human rights, and other things that were not in the law and development agenda, because it was assumed that if you built law to help the economy, that would take care of all the other stuff. But it turned out that that wasn't a good idea. And there was a question about, okay, so wait a minute. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Wait a minute, what am I doing? I'm going, don't look. Wait a minute. How do I get back? I don't want to do that. Mario, how do I get back to the beginning? Look at this. This is just to entertain you, to keep you awake. Okay. Thank you, sir. All right, so how are we doing here?
I didn't see anything.
You didn't see anything. Okay. So there emerges then in the, and we're talking now, Law and Development 1.0 ends by the mid to late 70s, and a new vision of development emerges. Now we're talking about development studies and development policy rather than law, specifically. Globalization as an active policy. Limit the state role in the economy, strengthen the market. The state's the problem, the market's the solution, deal with that. And you have to have independent means. If you want democracy and the rule of law, you don't get it automatically by reforming the economy. You've got to do that separately. Let's call this a neoliberal vision. There were restrictions, there were critiques of that which came along with it and are still there. Restrictions on the state stifle innovation. Market liberalization favors global capital. The rule of law legitimates the hegemony of this whole system. Now, that led to Law and Development 2.0. So the first thing is that the agencies, particularly led by the World Bank, which picked up law as a major goal for development assistance. The World Bank had not been involved in Law and Development 1.0 at all, or almost not at all. So the agencies grew up, expanded. Billions of dollars were spent by development agencies on law reform around the world, not in Brazil. The World Bank tried to start a judicial reform project in Brazil, and the Supreme Court blocked it. An interesting story that would be worth some study. In the legal profession, you got the growth of global north-south networks in business law that were engaged in reform of law at the domestic and international level. Obviously, these networks existed, but they became much more important in this period because of the desire to transform national law to fit into the globalizing system. And I've written an article about this, which some of you may be interested in. NGOs were part of this effort to separately support human rights and other rights. And in the academy, the field grew, no longer driven by the agencies, but more independent for a variety of reasons I don't have time to talk about. So Law and Development 2.0 really is made up of three parts because the profession now and the NGOs, agencies, academy, they're all sort of involved and influence each other, and if I was really good, I could make these things move so you'd see like gears, but I'm not. So that's, you know, I'm still at PowerPoint 1.0. Okay. So you know, I could go on and on, but we're running late, and I don't want to keep you any longer, not too much longer. Mario, how do you go back on this thing? Jesus. Okay, there you go. Sorry. All right. Okay. I don't know. Anyway. Okay. So now we go to the present. So, but I've skipped a huge period of the building up of the academic field. This is the period of the history of FGV. Is the last 15 years as law and development grows globally as an academic field. It may not be called law and development. We're going to get to that, right? But studies of how law relates to developmental goals by academics north and south has become, at least in you want me to start again? Study. No, you heard that. Did you? Oh.
I don't want to lose a recording.
Not a word. You don't want to lose a word. I mean, you know, that's 50 years from now, people will be studying this speech, of course. I'm sorry. Okay. So this, say, the last 20 years, in the academies in the North and in the South, as FGV has emerged and the law and development program here developed, and other universities around the world in the South have done similar things, you've gotten the substantial growth of academic work about the issues that law and development was started to deal with, and that the scholars in self-estrangement try to open up the territory for a more serious inquiry into those issues. So assume that there is this vast amount of material. But we now confront three major problems: contextualization, fragmentation, and hegemony. So contextualization. When the field started, there was belief that somehow we would find universal rules and universal models that could be copied or at least adapted in all around the world. And there are still people who believe this, but this faith has waned as various factors are taken into account. First, of course, is the embeddedness of local legal systems that mean that there is no one size that fits all. And secondly, as new ideas about development emerge and there's more stress on innovation and finding innovative pathways to development, therefore universal formulae no longer hold, because it's local experimentation that becomes the answer to how you find the best developmental path for any given country or region or industry. At the same time, in the academic world, what was at least seemed to be held together as in terms of common understandings, general interaction, intellectual uniformity, not uniformity, but engagement, has fragmented as the original law and development area becomes divided into a lot of specializations. And although there is, as we see here, the flourishing of law and development type work in the Global South, and inspired by domestic ideas, by original contributions, and so on, there still is lingering concern about the dominance of views from the Global South. So those are, I think, the three great crises we face today. So let's look at contextualization. Well, the loss of face in transplants, covering rules, that is, uniform rules. And I've sort of suggested a lot of this. We know about the failure of transplants. The development in East Asia, which developed along lines very different from that conceptualized by Law and Development 1.0 and by the prevailing ideas of the World Bank and other agencies, raised some questions about some of the ideas that were built into law and development, even post-scholars. And these other items also. Universal prescriptions and experimentation. Universal prescriptions are dubious, and experimentation is much more important. So contextualization is the first challenge. How do we deal with this? Then we have fragmentation. So this is just a list I came up with in a hurry. These are all areas that exist, that around which there's scholarship globally, north, south, whatever, law and finance, law and investment and trade. This is what I'm now doing, just in case anyone wants. Now I'm doing trade and investment law, and I'm not worrying about other things that I've worried about. But that's a specialty. That's a whole world. There's Vera here, right? I have to talk to Vera now because I need to deal with those people, and it's a full-time job. I don't have time for some of the other things. But that's what I mean by specialization. I mean, if you want to do this, if you want to do international trade and investment law and its relation to development, I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, this is a full-time job, and you have to learn all sorts of stuff that you didn't learn before. So this is just an example. And then women in development, I mean, this is, again, it's a full-time job. There's literature, there's meetings, there's conferences, there's whatever. Okay. Now, not only are these substantive cleavages, but there are also other forms of cleavages. Well, of course, they're all the topics, so that's the first. But then within the area, within each of these areas, or many of them, you have different kinds of orientations. You have the academic versus the professional. You have the activists, those people who want to change things, versus the critics, those people who just want to say, oh, it's all terrible and blah, 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 the world's coming to an end, which is fun, by the way. Then you have developmental strategy. You have, and this is too simple, but there are multiple views about a proper developmental strategy, neoliberal, sort of new developmental state, whatever. So there, again, another set of cleavages. The donor community. So some of the big donor agencies that are still influencing law and development are focused primarily on growth, and others focus more primarily on human development. And then, of course, you have scholarly fields, because the economists have gotten into the business of law and development. And I don't mean just in the trade area, where, of course, they've always been there, but in property rights and the role of judges and things like that. The economists have all of a sudden moved into this field. And so then the economists and the lawyers and their cleavages between them. So these are, so what you've got is this topical cleavage, and then within the topics, all these other things. So now, this is great because it's really much more interesting than, law and development 1.0 was boring. But on the other hand, it's kind of hard to keep track of. And then we have the dominance of the North. So the World Bank and other powerful agencies still influence the discourse, and of course they have immense resources. And while the Global South, and here we are, evidence of it, is developing its own approach to law and development and institutions relative to the strength of institutions in the North, still relatively weak and spotty. There are actually 1,200 law schools in Brazil, Oscar, today. As somebody said, that's as of yesterday. We don't know what it'll be tomorrow. But how many of them have an active, interdisciplinary, globally linked law and development program? Well, we won't say much more about that. And there are problems because sometimes people in the South who get training in the North become part of silos that replete some of the cleavages, so that the cleavages that we see in the North get reproduced in the South because of a kind of silo effect. So the law and economics people who from the South will go and study with law and economics people in Germany or the United States, and then they will come back and they will keep those relationships, but not necessarily have relationships with people who are doing human rights, who are in the human rights silo. Okay, these are necessary costs of specialization, but they're also costs in terms of lost integration. Oh, damn. That's okay. This is the end. Oh, what a relief. Okay, so there have been people who've tried to find ways out of this crisis. So so one answer is, let's just look at the economy, and let's just look at data, and then that's what law and development is. It's the relationship between legal variable A and economic variable B. And we will do this, and we've got data, and we can do that. Okay, I mean, that should be part of law and development, but these people say, and that's all, because everything else is too messy. Human rights is too messy, women's rights are too messy, the environment is too messy, it's all mess. But then you lose the whole purpose of the project, which was general empowerment and general human development. So that's not this. Okay. Then you could have joint subfields, human rights and development, climate change and development. Good idea, I'm all in favor, but it only solves a part of the problem. And then, okay, well, maybe you could have these larger subfields and then you could have dialogues among them, but there's no institutional structure to do that. Okay, how about context? Well, one answer is that you study foreign models, but the experts, not the foreigners, craft the policy solutions, so they are actually built around local knowledge and local understanding of local conditions. Great, but we don't have enough people who know how to do it. Okay, an idea that I've promoted, Mario and I did a whole conference on this a long time ago, develop horizontal learning among similarly situated countries. Well, what's a similarly situated country? But instead of law and development in the South studying what's going on in the French capital market, what about the Indian capital market or the Chinese capital market or the Brazilian capital market, and see what you can learn from that rather than trying to figure out something that's been in existence for 200 years and was done in a whole different way. That's a great idea, and I'm all in favor of it, but the North-South silos and the sort of academic tradition that you look toward, in the South looks toward some places in the North, is a problem. And then, of course, the legal systems are so varied. So you try to get a dialogue between Brazilians and Indians, which we tried. We had 2 meetings. But it's very difficult because they can't take the time to learn about the specifics of each other's systems in order to find the commonalities, because the specifics seem to sort of overtake, So ways out of the crisis. Okay, well, strengthen research, practice, and capacity in the developing world. Okay, but the universities, this means confronting the broader question of the universities, because this isn't just a law issue. I say, there should be more North-South doctoral degrees, or doctoral degrees that are done as in some kind of dialogic fashion, so that that the people in the North are getting more exposure and understanding of the conditions in the South on the ground, rather than just sitting in some classroom or looking at some quantitative data set. And meanwhile, the people in the South are getting exposed to a lot of debates and so on in the global literature. And then these other issues are also possible. But all of this requires robust action in the South. We need not just one FGV, we need 50. So that could be our new goal, the 50 FGVs around the world program. Maybe we can sell it to the UN. So as you look ahead, and it's you who look ahead. I'm now law and development guru emeritus, right? This is my swan song on the fate of law and development. I pass the baton to all of you. But think about this. For those of us who struggled in this for our lifetime, or much of our lifetime, it was always a project of emancipation. There was always a view that somehow it had something to do with democracy, equity, and the rule of law. Although we made errors. The knowledge has to be useful. There's no point in just making this an academic game. It has to be useful. It has to be interdependent. We have to find ways to take account, even through all this fragmentation and cleavages, of all the dimensions. It has to be interdisciplinary, because law and development is an interdisciplinary enterprise. It asks questions that can only be satisfactorily answered using techniques and methodologies that are not built into the training of lawyers. It doesn't mean that you have to be interdisciplinary teams, although that's usually a solution. But lawyers doing this have to have an interdisciplinary vision. They have to understand and be able to work with economics, sociology, political science, whatever is relevant. And I think that it's important to maintain contact with various forms of networks, both global and local, emancipatory networks, professional networks, so that the academic project is not just an isolated experience of people talking to each other and citing wonderful articles that they wrote 40 years ago. Thank you very much.